Good evening. There you go. Welcome to the 45th Loeb reunion. All right. That's much better. I want to welcome Loeb alumni, GSD alumni, students, staff, faculty, and friends to this evening, and to the start of what I hope will be for everyone a terrific experience over the next 2.5 days. I'm John Peterson. I'm the newly minted Loeb curator. I still have that new, fresh curator smell. So, in the audience here, it's appropriate for me next to recognize the architects of the modern day Loeb Fellowship. Bill Doble. Bill, do you mind standing up? Jim Stockard. Jim, are you here? Oh, there he is. 45-year-old institution, and we have 2 people to lead the ship. It's extraordinary. And of course, the 2 people who are not here that we're always grateful for and raise a glass to often enough, John and Frances Loeb. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce the most envied people in the room, our current class of Loeb Fellows. Will you please stand up? Please meet every one of them before you end this weekend. Now, a little bit of housekeeping, but valuable to many of those in the room. So this whole weekend, because of Eddie, is a CEU certified weekend. So for architects, landscape architects, and planners, you get a chance to earn your CEU points, but you have to sign up at the registration table up there. With that, I'm honored to introduce our opening keynote speaker. Callie Curry, also known as the artist Swoon, is an activist, artist, and community developer. She started her career path at Pratt in Brooklyn, but quickly became frustrated with the narrowly defined conventional path of an artist. And her work moved out into the street where she could find a much broader, more accessible audience. And that path has led her to the creation of flotillas in Venice, to reconstruction work in Haiti and far beyond, and you'll see tonight. Her work is collected by the Museum of Modern Art in New York. She's exhibited at the New Orleans Art Museum and the Brooklyn Museum, and she held her first solo show in London in 2011. I think she's particularly meaningful as a speaker for us because I hope you see an overlap between her work and her path and her choices. And I think that the challenges that we face as shapers of the built environment, she has sought a path that brought her work to a much broader audience without compromising an aesthetic rigor. She's maintained an artistic license and expectation even as she's brought her work to folks literally on the street, passersby on the street. And I would ask, as you see her work, see her own choices, that you reflect on our path as professionals and shapers of the built environment and get clues for how we can do the same, where we can maintain high aesthetic and artistic expectations even as we serve a population that is far beyond the narrow slice of culture in this country and around the world that our profession generally serves. With that, join me in welcoming Callie Curry. Thank you.
Hi, how are you guys? Give me just 1 second to get this sorted out. Okay, wow, thanks. This is a really, really great turnout tonight, and I've been super honored to speak at Harvard. So, my name is Caledonia Curry, and I'm gonna give you a lot of background about my work and my projects. But first, I want to start on a kind of a personal note. I have really been kind of digging deep into the relationship between how who we are as people really is kind of the driver for what we're doing out in the world. And so I felt that it was kind of important lately to sort of start with who we are. And it always makes me a little nervous to do this. But the thing I sort of kept in mind as I was coming over is I have a friend who's a songwriter, and one of her songs made me cry recently, and I sent her a message like, hey, you know, your song made me cry. And she said, thanks, that's part of my job. I help people feel their feelings. I help them cry. And I was like, okay, I really felt kind of emboldened to understand so much of the role of the artist as being sort of part of the way that we process emotions culturally. So that said, I'm going to take you through a bunch of my different projects, and I'm just going to kind of start with this base idea that is, you know, I was asked when coming here to Loeb, like, think about what is most important to you and why you do what you do. Like, what's the kind of like deep message that's driving all of these things? And at different points, we can always answer that question differently. But right now, I realized that what I really wanted to talk about are the different kind of subtle forms that acts of resistance can take. Grab a water. So, to give a little bit of kind of a personal background about how I came to this idea about acts of resistance, I'll explain a little bit about my childhood. So I grew up in a super, super difficult place. I was born to two heroin-addicted parents, and if you can imagine, the chaos of that situation was quite immense. Just a lot of experiences of being with parents who were in rehab or who were in jail or who were in the mental hospital strapped down on suicide watch. Just a very kind of a dark time. And for me, you know, when I was a teenager, I always had this feeling like, okay, this is a kind of a genetic predestiny. Like, this is the thing that's coming for me, and I just have to wait for when my specific version of this befalls me. And then I reached about the age of 26, and I was doing okay, and I started to breathe a little sigh of relief because all the textbooks said, like, okay, you know, if you make it to 26 and it hasn't happened to you, then maybe you're okay. So I just kept going, and I was like working my butt off and just defying all of the odds in all of the ways that I could imagine, you know, because I had discovered painting when I was about 10 years old, and it very, very, very much became an anchor for me and became this way that I got incredible positive feedback and really kind of kept my sanity, I felt, you know. And so here I was, and I was, not only had I survived, which seemed like a kind of a miracle, but I was succeeding. And that felt like such a wild card to have drawn that I just had this attitude where I was like, okay, let's see what else we can do that shouldn't be able to be done, you know? And, you know, I had moved to New York, and I had become an artist, and I got involved in a lot of political organizing and kind of resistance work. And, you know, resistance around, you know, post-September 11th and the US involvement in the Iraq War, or resistance around our current version of capitalism and its promise to totally destroy the last remaining ecosystems that support us. And then slowly, I think maybe out of a kind of a weariness from sort of throwing myself against big systems, I started to look for forms of resistance that could be found through creation. And so I started to work in a couple of different communities that had gone through disasters, both fast and slow. So I had started to work in Haiti post-earthquake 2010, and I also started to work in a town called Braddock, Pennsylvania, which has suffered a kind of a slow economic devastation. And then a really huge shift happened in my life and created a really enormous perspective shift that really changed how I understood all the work that I'm going to show you in a minute. And I came to a kind of a crossroads in my own personal life and started to study trauma. And I was studying the effects of trauma on the human psyche. And I discovered the work of a doctor named Gabor Mate, and he's an addiction doctor that works with addicts in Vancouver. And he said something that was really shocking to me. Somehow I'd never heard it before. He said that the one factor that all of his Skid Row junkies had in common was a childhood marked by severe abuse, neglect, and trauma. And it was really so shocking for me that I went on to study, and I learned that not only is it addiction, but suicide, mental illness, violence, so many things that people struggle with all have their roots in a young life marked by terror and helplessness. And so this light went on for me, and I started to think maybe this has meaning for my family and for where I'm coming from. And so I started to speak with my parents, and they started to tell me stories of severe neglect and sexual abuse, all stories that had been totally silent up until that point. And suddenly I began to make sense of where I came from, and I realized that there was nothing random about my family and the state that it was in, and there was also nothing genetically fated about it. I realized that through a cycle of catastrophic events that I had come to be, I was born in an extremely broken place. And so that understanding is kind of the new understanding that I'm bringing here today, that is really informing some of the looking back that I'm doing in my work. And so I'm going to pause and kind of shift gears and start, taking you through sort of the work. And then at the end, I just want to kind of come back and reflect on what this understanding has given me. So I started out as a visual artist, as a printmaker, and as a very classical drawer. And I had a kind of I studied at Pratt. I had this sort of breakdown where, as John was saying, I felt like I needed to be connected to something more, and I felt like I wanted to be a part of my world in a different way. And I was obsessed with cities. I was obsessed with, the sort of psychology of spaces and the way that we built our cities, because I was a country kid. And so when I got to the city, it really blew my mind. And I just saw this language. It felt to me like in some ways I was like, cities are the highest art form. I am a portrait artist. How will I create things that look at people and that look at their built environment and that become part of those places? This is a piece that someone took to a rock for me. And so very immediately, I also started to see how putting things within the urban context creates really incredible kinds of moments with very deep and specific meanings. Here's another, this one's very small, but I went with the stencil artist Banksy and his group to Bethlehem, Palestine, and created work on the partition wall there. And so I without getting too much into that body of work, there was a thing that happened for me where I started out as this kind of very classically trained artist, and I went outside and started working on city streets, and everything changed for me really radically. And there were all of these questions opening up around public space, the ownership of walls, the ownership of billboards, commercialization of our cities, sort of who owns the dialogue and why. And then all of these questions just kind of about cities themselves, and how do they look to us, and how do they feel to us, and how do we interact with them. And I also around this time started to be asked to do installations, and so I chose a lot of slides for tonight for you guys because this is the Loeb Fellowship and people are so much looking at the urban environment, where I found that I was really looking at the creation of cities and structures and spaces in this kind of very specific but very fantastical way. And John and I were just talking before we started, and we were talking about how as artists, our constraints are so far fewer than so many people who are in architecture and community building. And so you have this kind of really incredibly like imaginative, fluid space within which you can kind of play around with the idea of what our built environment can be. And so for me, that has been what a lot of drawing and the creation of installations has been about kind of imagining and reimagining cities, but in this way that's like utterly kind of constraintless, where I sort of feel like I'm allowing people into the dream world of my kind of imagination in terms of building spaces. And the act of working outside, I think, and of always creating things which had so much of a context meant that when I did come back inside, I was really a different person. I had kind of created a life for myself outside of the institutions. And then when institutions started to ask me to come in and to sort of create things, I had a kind of a crisis of conscience where I was like, oh, wait a minute, I'm outside. I'm doing this kind of rebellious thing. Does it make sense to really be inside? And I kind of quickly realized that I had a lot to say, and that because I had so much created my own kind of inner world and outer world and like community of creativity, that what I was going to bring back into these settings was actually quite different, and that I had a lot to say. So the next project I just want to go through really briefly, John also referred to as flotillas of rafts. So I had become really obsessed with the idea of like, how do you speak to different communities? So pasting things on the wall was this kind of very first impulse of being like, let's get outside of museums and institutions and spaces that are formally about art making, and let's go to people where they live and where they are. And so one of the kind of early ideas that came to me was about the building of boats and about the traveling down the Mississippi River, because it's such a main artery of our country. And so I got together with a huge group of friends, and we kind of envisioned this massive project. We collected all kinds of garbage. We did all kinds of tactical and logistical work, and we got together and we built it. And we had a lot of questions about how can 30 people live sustainably on a traveling, home? How can, what are we communicating to people with that gesture? Are we performing? Here we are with our mentor, Papa Neutrino, who built scrap rafts and went transatlantic and kind of taught us how to do it. And we're kind of giving performances because it was a real way to connect with people who would be like, who are you? What are you? And you would just say like, okay, show up at 7 and we'll sing really badly, and then you'll think we're funny and you'll like bring us potato salad. But it was one of the most incredible experiences of my life, the intense freedom of having imagined and built your own home, and of having created artworks, which are these ridiculous, unlikely kind of floating. They were really fun. Here we are rafted up in the Adriatic Sea. And so we did this over 4 years. We went for 2 years down the Mississippi River, we went down the Hudson River, and we also went in the Adriatic Sea to Venice. Because for me, I had just always been so blown away by the city of Venice, and so interested in the idea of creating something that really echoed and interacted directly with this city, that was like almost like Venice was the mothership. And of course I was also thinking a lot about climate change and rising seas and like the sort of perilous coastal communities, and particularly self-built communities, and what that means to be a fragile self-built community in rising seas. They loved us. We can talk later about how we managed to get past the police and the Coast Guard and everyone else. And so for me, this project was also a really big turning point, because if you can imagine, it was nearly impossible to do. Here we are sneaking into the Grand Canal at night. Everyone under the sun has said no to us. You can't come into the Grand Canal. It's one of the oldest waterways in Europe. We have our own laws over our dead bodies. You're not coming into this waterway. And I had built these boats to within an inch of those bridges. So I was like, oh, no, they're going. So we just waited until 3 a.m. one night, and we went. And it was so incredible and so beautiful and so moving. And yet, even in the midst of one of the most magical times of my entire life, I had this like really gnawing feeling where I was like, okay, we just moved mountains. We just raised insane amounts of money because although they look like piles of garbage, it's actually quite expensive to feed and clothe and house and do all, well, not clothe, but all this with all these people. And we had done so much and just kind of, bent and broken so many rules and got past so much bureaucracy and just like mobilized the force of our entire community and the service of this beautiful moment and like, hooray for us, like I don't regret it. And at the same time, I just thought, God, what about if we tried to put this to a different use? Like, this is amazing, and yet there's this really gnawing, kind of nagging part of me that's like, there's situations in the world that need this kind of energy, and we're just like rah-rahing around on these boats. And so it was amazing, but I after that moment in the Grand Canal, I was like, okay, I have to put this project to bed. And shortly thereafter, the earthquake of 2010 struck Haiti. And as all of you, I'm sure, remember, it was such a devastating moment, not just for Haitians, but also kind of around the world and for people. I was a Floridian and feeling like, okay, these people are so close off the coast of Florida. These are our neighbors, and this is happening. And how can I take what I had just been thinking about all of the creativity and resource mobilization that we had been doing and kind of offer this to our neighbors in this moment of crisis? And so I did some thinking and realized, like, okay, we're a small community. We probably shouldn't go straight to Port-au-Prince. We should probably think about connecting with another small community. And so over the course of a few months with Thaddeus Pawlowski, who's here, and some other folks, we just came up with a plan that involved taking a style of architecture known as super adobe, which was invented by Iranian-born architect named Nader Khalili. And he was a kind of a mainstream skyscraper architect who then spent the last 20 years of his life trying to address the issue of housing globally. And so he had this really beautiful thought where he was like, hey, I grew up around this really traditional style of architecture that's very specific to Iran, but which is really quite incredible. How could I take all of the learning that I have done as like an international architect and combine it with this traditional knowledge and create something which is really, really, really lasting for people around the world? And so he designed this style called super adobe, and it involves using 10% cement and 90% earth and creating these structures which use the shape of the dome, and which you get these structures that are just kind of indestructible. They're like flood, hurricane, fire, tornado, earthquake. Like they're very hard to damage. And so it's a system that's pre-engineered, it can be learned, and it's made with available resources. And so we realized that we didn't have to import anything, and that we could learn it and that we could teach it. And so this seemed like a really kind of a powerful moment. And so here we are a year after the earthquake, and we're opening the community center. And I remember this moment about 6 months after the quake when we were in full go mode. We were in total building mode, and people were coming by and they were like, oh my God, how are you guys doing this? Like, all of the organizations that we know of all have their materials stuck in customs. They're locked into this gridlock of the kind of crazy situation that's happening. Like, how are you guys already in full construction? And for me, it was a really beautiful moment because I had this very deep instinct where I was like, okay, I get that we don't look qualified to be doing this. I get that we're just like a group of scraggly artists. I get that we're not a massive NGO. We're not like first responders. But I have this hunch that as a very small group of people who really intensely believes in possibility and is willing to work on this very small scale, I think that we have something that can be uniquely powerful in this moment. And that turned out to be true. And so we connected with this community, we built a community center, and then we've just kind of kept working with them over the period of 5 years in a very slow, steady way. And the thing that we have found is that we didn't have like a magic solution where we were like, hooray, super adobe is going to save everything. And that instead what we found was that what we were creating was a relationship with a place. And that we are a small creative group of people from away, and we are connecting with another small, very creative group of people here in Haiti, and we're going to keep working together and keep changing. So, for example, most of the photos that I'm showing right now are super adobe construction. But, we built the first 2 homes in super adobe, and then we started to think about, okay, what are the economics of that? And even though this system of building is designed to be very, very affordable, the economics of Haiti are such that it's actually still out of people's reach in rural Haiti. And so we have decided to keep working with people to keep adapting and figuring out different methods of building. And so, as John was saying, keeping aesthetics in mind, for me also as an artist, I've always had a really kind of a deep feeling that there is a power in beauty and in soulfulness and attention to detail, even while you're in the midst of rebuilding after a disaster. And so this one's a little wild, but the whole step of the way, we decided that, we weren't first responders after a disaster. We were kind of involved in this long-term rebuilding, and so we were going to take into account the creation of structures which were stable and permanent, and which incorporated the kind of crafts and skills of people in the area, because it's a village of stone carvers, and they're super talented. And this slide is here to cue me that we're about to start having some fun in the community center, because we built one community center and 2 homes over the course of a few years that we were there. And then the fundraising started to get really difficult because we were getting a few years out since the earthquake, and we also started to really feel that we had rushed in, and even though we were moving kind of slow, we were still in post-disaster mode, we were still like, go, 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 and we were like, okay, it's a few years out, let's settle down, let's slow down, let's get into like a little bit of deeper relationship building and a little bit of further kind of asking of like, what's next? What does this relationship really mean? And so we started to, the community center was built, and so we started to just, make trips where we were just playing and we were having fun with kids, and we were kind of doing classes and art making and different things. And then from there, I made a decision to reach out to an incredible play-based educator that I had seen doing some work in upstate New York. And he kind of designed a series of workshops that were around turning the community center into like a camera obscura as a kind of an opening gesture to start a learning center in the community center. And so we've since gone back and worked with, this is a group of teachers that have kind of emerged out of the community that we now have been fundraising, and we are able to pay them salaries to kind of keep a learning club going that is doing all different kinds of things. And so one of the sort of changes that has happened is that people in the village have started to want to grow bamboo, because there's tons of erosion and deforestation in Haiti. We work with a group of farmers, and so they've started to think a lot about bamboo to feed the cows, to hold soil, to do all kinds of different things. And so we made a decision that we wanted to kind of combine the work that we were doing architecturally with the work that we were doing around starting a learning center, and to do something where we would play with kids and kind of get them involved in the process of like learning about and designing bamboo constructions at the same time as their parents are working on growing bamboo. And then this will ultimately translate into what the next structure in Haiti becomes. So really brilliant, really like this kind of incredible force of nature just gets unleashed when you get, this is clay from the riverside, and so we did kind of a section on like, how did this super adobe dome get built? It's an earth construction. How does it work? And we'd roll the coils and say like, you remember watching the bags go up, and it's so fun, just like, I can't even describe the like burst of energy that comes from kids. And here we are kind of designing a town and saying like, okay, here's Comier, it's built on the river. Where would this house go? Where would that house go? And so we're just kind of thinking about, how do you have this like super deep level of involvement in ideas around structure building, like from the 3-year-old to the 80-year-old. And one really kind of great thing, this for me is like a happy moment about the community center. So what's going on here is this is a literacy class being taught to adults. And when we very, very first connected with the village in Comiers, we were going around Haiti researching for the project, and architect after community planner was saying to us, it doesn't matter that this place just had a major earthquake and that people are living in hot tents. If you're going to try to introduce a weird style of architecture, you cannot build a home. You have to build a community space or a school or something that people can all get their hands on together and decide that they trust it and they like it. So we were like, okay, this is real truth. And so we found this village, and people were saying, yeah, we have these literacy classes because the older generation doesn't know how to read, the younger generation does. So what we do, because we're embarrassed to have our kids watching us learn to write our names, is we get inside of a house, we shut all the windows, it's completely pitch black, it's 1,000 degrees, we light a bunch of candles, which only makes it hotter, and then we're hiding, trying to write our names. And they were like, if you could make something where we could shut the windows, but it still lets light in, then we could have our classes in privacy and in dignity. And so we built a community center, and then one of the kids who had been 15 and watching us build the whole time, all of a sudden this summer, he said, hey, I've been teaching literacy classes for the last 3 months. What do you guys think? And it was so beautiful. It was really a lovely moment to see that reappear. Here we are having a meeting with the Mango Growers Association, which is our local partner there, about bamboo. People are, learning and researching about building techniques and what different just the possibilities are. And this is a woman named Louisiana whose family house was damaged all the way in 2010. Her family moved into what was formerly the clinic in town. So they have a roof over their head, but the problem is that they're kind of occupying a space that if they could move out of it and it could be repaired, then the community will get a clinic back. And so here's the house that she was living in. Here we are kind of discussing all different kinds of things, from property law to what a new house should look like, to the meanings of kind of traditional decoration. And so our next step with Haiti is looking at this kind of collaboration with the farmers. Here's the clinic that's gonna get restored once they're able to move out of it. And so our next step is going to be working on a bamboo construction with Louisiana, and just going from there and kind of keeping the kids involved and keeping this whole way of working going. And so yeah, I'm gonna move on to the next project. So simultaneous for me with working with Haiti, because I'm not there full time, I'm back and forth, is also another project that I want to go into a little bit of detail about in a town called Braddock, Pennsylvania. So Braddock is a town that very iconically, like Detroit, like many places, has suffered really intensely from post-industrial collapse. It was the home of one of the first steel mills. It's actually still the home of one of the last steel mills, although 80% of the jobs have left, 80% of the population has moved, tons and tons of abandonment. And Braddock is also a really powerful place because just across the river in Homestead is actually the beginning of the entire labor movement in the United States. And so it's this really, really rich and storied place, which is just now in the middle of one of those slow motion disasters that is happening in so many places all over the United States. And when I first went there, I was invited there there was the mayor who was kind of calling in people to do urban farming in a lot of the vacant lots, and some friends of mine who I'd worked collectively with wanted to become farmers. We went to research. We were asked to do an art show in the area. And as we explored around, it was such a heavy and such an intense experience, scenes like this where people seem to have kind of moved out in the night. And somehow, even though, each day there was a heaviness that was really surprising to me, there was also something, as you can also probably imagine. And does anyone know the artist LaToya Ruby Frazier? She's somebody who is from North Braddock and who just speaks really, really powerfully about the fierceness of that community and about the importance of the way that we recognize the racial inequalities and so much of what is happening there. And so, I don't know, I just wanted to just give her a shout out because I really look to her critique of what has happened in Braddock as we sort of think about the work that we're doing there. But so this church, which is right at the boundary boundary of Braddock and North Braddock, was a building that was going to be demolished. It had been abandoned. It had become a halfway house, and then there was a fire. And when it was abandoned, all of the stained glass and the organs were removed. The roof was collapsing. Parts of the building had burned, and Braddock was going through one demolition after another. The bulldozers were basically rolling every single day. And so some people who were kind of working on saving some of the architecture just grabbed me and they were like, hey, you have a reputation for doing projects. Get over here, look at this building. What do you think about this? It's going to get demolished. And I was young and dumb, and I was like, oh, wow, that's really incredible. I really want to work on this. I really want to do a project in this town. And now, of course, I realize that anything on this scale is just utterly, utterly monumental. But I'm in there, and I'm sticking with it, and it's been an incredible process. And so what has happened is that a group, my friends who moved there to do urban farming, have since become permanent residents there and have done a lot of really incredible work in the community around building up arts programming in the library and farming, and just like tons of different ways of just being like, how do we be good neighbors and artists at the same time? And one of the steps that we started with was about deconstructing parts of the building that were broken rather than demolishing them. So, the bulldozers roll in, they push the buildings into their foundations, the field becomes a brown field, the materials are unreusable. So Transformative, my local artist partners there, learned about the deconstruction process and then found some contractors that were willing to work specifically in that way to take the building apart brick by brick, joist by joist, and to reuse the materials. And also, we just started working with kids, and the kids just want to come over on Saturday or after school. And one of the things that's been really incredible for me, I used to work with posters out on the street, and you put something up, you're gone, maybe you never even see it again. But doing this work in Haiti and doing this work in Braddock means that this is Juan when he was 9, and I realized I don't have the video. If you guys were doing a Kickstarter for this project, if you check out the video, you're going to see a 15-year-old who's very mature, and that's him. And so this process of just growing up with people and has been really incredible. And so, from early on, we just started plugging in kids in the community. This is a girl named Jayla who also, I think, started talking to me when she was about 12. And one day she just hollered over at me like, hey, you look sad, because I was staring at the building and thinking of how much work we had to do. And then we just kind of struck up a conversation. And then she came again a few years later and helped us. She volunteered on something and said, I'm so excited that this is going to be an art space one day. And I was like, baby, we are moving so slow. You might be grown up by the time this is open. And she was like, I don't care. This is good. I want to be a part of it. And so we just have kind of very slowly, one piece at a time, taken each phase of the work around this building and tried to figure out ways that it can creatively become part of its community. This was a moment, you see people laying a brick floor in a dome. So they're using the bricks from the deconstructed building, the parish house, and they're laying the floor of the dome, which was our teaching dome that we started the work in Haiti around. And then here we are doing some kind of small decorative gestures, painting the doors. Here's that dome in the field. So we have the church, and we also have the lot across the street. And we are just figuring out, all different kinds of kind of gardening and farming and just different ways to bring this space back to life in ways that also are engaging and also economically trying to push forward things in town, because 80% of jobs are gone. People are really quite desperate for work. And, occasionally people come over and volunteer or get a day's work here and there. But what we're really trying to do is to actually build ways that we can kind of provide long-term employment for people. Because, one thing that I learned in Haiti is that we worked after the earthquake and we rebuilt, and there were so many different side effects. One guy said, being able to get my hands on work in a time of crisis helped my mental health. It helped me stay sane, to be able to feel that I was affecting change in my community. And I was like, wow, I didn't realize that. And the other, I didn't realize that was going to happen. And the other thing that happened is that I realized that one of the most important things we were doing was providing jobs. It's simple, but you create spaces, and you create spaces of beauty and joy, and you also create spaces for people to come and have livelihood. And so one of the things that we're thinking about right now is this roof needs to be fixed. I don't know if you guys can see kind of in the distance there, there's just like a sealant is covering the roof. And so the project that we're working on right now is to create a ceramic studio, a fully functioning commercial ceramic studio in the basement. And we want to hand make the like 20,000 tiles that it's going to take to rebuild this roof. Raise your hand if you've ever seen like St. Stephen's in Vienna, the kind of beautiful, like colorful churches with the... So I saw that when I was a teenager. Here's a portrait of a local woman, Catherine G., that I made. I saw that and I just thought, my God, like if we need to fix this roof, like I looked at tar paper shingles, you know, there's a lot of toxicity there, like a lot of the sort of more affordable ceramic tile options, tons of stuff was looking like it needs to be imported from China. And there was this feeling of like, okay, we're working in a place where industry has divested, where jobs have left. Does it really make sense to import things, or would it be an incredible gesture to try to bring back this culture of making? And so here we are working with kids to paint a scale model of what the church could look like with this beautiful colored roof. And you know, making sort of various proposals. And so the stage that we're at right now is we've started doing some prototyping in the ceramic studio in the library, which is there. It's too small to fix the entire roof, but it's big enough so that we can start playing around. Here's our local ceramicist. And we're just working with kids in the neighborhood, people who are coming to sort of do skill shares with us, like all different people who have a kind of something to contribute to this larger puzzle. And, you know, the significance of working with kids in the neighborhood is that we've been working for years with the Broadest Youth Program. And what is happening is that we have these relationships with kids that are aging out of the program. So I really shouldn't be calling them kids anymore. They're becoming adults. And yeah, exactly. And, you know, who have kids of their own and who are saying like, okay, I need a real job now. And so for me, it's kind of this moment of sort of stepping up and saying, okay, I'm starting to learn what it really means to work in community in a long-term way. You know, how can we make this real for people? How can we become an anchor in the community? And so we're working on the tile studio. We're starting to do some decorative tiles as well, because I figure, you know, thinking about aesthetics, thinking about what our skill set is, thinking about beauty, and just trying to kind of bring together everything that is my strength with this situation to see if we can get something going. And so this is our first kind of product line. And like I said, we have a Kickstarter, so you guys can look it up. It's called Adriatic Tiles. And we've got all of these different tiles available on it. And we're going to be collaborating with kind of artist tiles. And then we're also going to be making commercial tiles and roof tiles. And hopefully within the next year or so, we're going to get the roof fixed. So here's a little scale model of what the building could look like. Looks like a dollhouse, but it's quite gargantuan. And it's just been such a huge process, and in a lot of ways it's just beginning. I feel like we're kind of just getting our firepower now, so keep an eye for us. And so the last thing that I want to say, just like in closing, is to sort of go back to where I started when I was talking about, you know, I've been doing all this work for years, and yet somehow in the last couple of years I've had a real perspective shift on it. And in thinking about what I wanted to say tonight, I think that what I really realized from everything that I just told you is that there are forms of resistance which take the form of not settling for the brokenness of like the way things are, you know, and that also are kind of about not seeing that brokenness as inevitable. And I think that in a way, this kind of resistance sort of begins with naming it. Like, for example, in Haiti, kind of understanding that there was nothing random about the level of devastation that was caused by the earthquake in Haiti, and that it couldn't really be simplified just as like a natural disaster, because an earthquake of a very similar magnitude happened in France and never even really made the news. And the reason for that is because all of the wealth of Haiti had already been extracted to France. And so people in France, as a result of that, are able to build their homes to last. While in Haiti, the price of one bag of cement is the same as one day's wage. You know, or like in Haiti, where it's, you know, a few years ago there was this Levi's ad, and one of their kind of lines was, people just got sad and moved away. And I thought, that is crazy. People didn't get sad and move away. It's not even really okay to look at it like that. It's so important to see that, even though what I have found is that people in those communities do often take on the stigma of what has happened and sort of personalize the shame of living in a town that's undergoing what Braddock is undergoing, what's the most important thing for us to recognize at the outset is that big industry came into Braddock like a rising tide and left like a tsunami. And what we have left, for me, is the question of how do we make meaning out of this suffering. And so the thing, the lesson that I brought up with talking about my own family is that within my family, I learned that simply calling the tragedy by its true name is in itself a kind of an act of resistance. So understanding that, for example, for me, understanding that my parents weren't just kind of crazy hedonist drug addicts that didn't feel like taking care of their kids and that just preferred drugs to their children, and that understanding this other perspective, which is that they were deeply, deeply damaged people who were trying to self-medicate and they were using the wrong kinds of medicine, and seeing that I grew up in a culture of silence and in a culture that blamed the victims and that left us all awash in a very, very deep sense of powerlessness. And so within my family, my work has been on how do I change that culture of blaming the victim and of silence, and how do I try to end those cycles of powerlessness that I was born into. And then when I look outward and sort of try to take that lesson into the world, I see that these situations where you have this kind of big, loud, dramatic symptom that's happening on the outside, and which is very often actually kind of a mask for these very much more entrenched, deep root causes, that whether or not you're seeing those kinds of situations in your personal life or you're seeing them societally, that always, 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 those situations are a call for us to bring forth so many varied and stubborn different kinds of acts of resistance. And so for me, like using the tools that I have at my disposal, the thing that I have seen is that creating meaningful work for people in a time of devastation becomes an anchor and becomes a way of, rebuilding sanity and rebuilding community, and that there's a true dignity in beauty, and that alone can be really generative for a community. And then also something that I'm learning really recently is that the language of creativity, in all of its kind of like beautiful and aesthetic and symbolic, instinctual ways, that's a language that really speaks to us in a way that no other language does. And that as we're healing and as we're rebuilding, it's absolutely an essential part of that process. And so I guess I just want to say in closing that the thing that I'm seeing is that when we can get together with everyone who has a stake in and who's been involved in situations of devastation, and when we can all use all of our creativity and all of our willpower to work together to try to make whole what has been broken, that doing that becomes such a deep act of resistance, and it's a resistance against the mechanisms that serve to hold powerlessness in place. And so I just want to say thanks. Thank you. I think we'll take a couple questions. If anyone has any questions. What's next? Well, what's next is keeping going. So the project that I showed in Braddock is like in this really like power phase of trying to get that ceramic studio started. The project in Haiti is in a similar phase of trying to, develop the kind of work around bamboo. I have another project that I didn't mention of a musical architecture that's been happening for a few years in New Orleans. And then, I kind of spoke about my family because I have just recently kind of started to delve deep into the study of trauma and kind of personal psychology. And I just got back from Philadelphia, where I was working with people in prison and people in rehab, and kind of really looking kind of deeply and with people who are affected by it at those links, and kind of thinking about how we can understand that culturally. And so I guess what's next is keeping going and sort of figuring out like how we understand trauma and how we understand healing and how we understand creativity, and just each of the projects. And more drawing too. Anybody else have a question? I see a hand right there.
Hi, thanks so much for coming. I actually lived in Pittsburgh for 5 years, so I'm very familiar with your work in Braddock. And I was wondering if you could talk about the enthusiasm from John Fetterman, who was the mayor, is mayor of Braddock, and just how that has moved your project forward.
Yeah. Well, John Fetterman put out the initial call for farmers. I have since been collaborating less closely with him. He's just busy on tons of projects, and more closely with my local partners, Transformative. But he definitely instigated that kind of moment of people knowing that there was some enthusiasm around farming and rebuilding, and just trying to work with youth programs and get stuff going locally in that particular place. Sorry, I don't know, that's not a very good answer, but I don't know if you guys know much about John Fetterman, but he's sort of one of many kind of mayors and local figures who have decided to just really take head on this challenge that's presented by Rust Belt cities, and this challenge that's kind of presented to all of us of like, just what do we do? Like, how do we not see this as a hopeless situation? How do we recognize the resources that are present? How do we recognize, for us, it's been like, how do we see that this is not like some abandoned town, but there are tons of people there, and how do we value the people that live there and the resources that are still there, and do so creatively, even as people who, like me, I live in New York City, but how do I kind of keep a cross connection between my life in New York and my life working on other projects and the life of this really specific town? Anyone else have a question? I see a hand back there and one right here.
I've been really moved by your work over the years, and I was wondering, you really maintain a self-reflexive awareness of the possibilities of the projects, the problems, and how to like be mindful in each space and in each project. I was wondering if there's people outside of your work that inspire you to kind of maintain that, because it's very easy once you get into the museum world to kind of have one answer for your work and like not question its own problems or limitations, and kind of not let it grow, and yours just keeps growing and keeps being very self-aware.
Yeah, my secret is actually good collaborators. I choose better people who are smarter than me to work with. And so, like, for example, in Haiti, I will really often forget to have big meetings. And my collaborators are like, what are you doing? You can't just show up, and we have to be having big conversations, and we have to be having them constantly. And just because you had one last month doesn't mean that people's thoughts and feelings are the same this month. And I get going so fast that I'll forget that. I'll straight up just be like, oh, whatever, we're da, 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 And so I very specifically work with collaborators who are like, no, this is the important piece of this. This is how this works. Don't forget to pay attention to the details. People who aren't afraid to give me shit and yell at me and, be really grumpy and be like, come on, we got to do this in the right way, because I need that. You're right. Like when you get going and you're like on budgets and deadlines and you're worried about presenting the thing and how does it look from the outside, I need people who are keeping me very, very grounded and like, yeah, but how is it actually being lived? What does it look like from the inside? Yeah, right there.
Working outside and then working inside. I saw your work in the Brooklyn Museum.
Oh, yeah.
And it was really wonderful environment, but you were also sending a message. So could you talk about the interior work?
Okay. So sort of talk about kind of the themes that were within that? Yeah, okay. So I did a big installation at the Brooklyn Museum that was super it was a big part of 2014. So I'm happy that you saw it. It was really a massive labor of love for me. And like I said, I'm really so much into creating kind of environments, and I didn't really kind of go into like what was happening in that environment. And the Brooklyn Museum was a big moment for me of, I think, first having an awakening about what I was saying about kind of really making a link between sort of histories of trauma and regeneration and healing and growth and the moment that we're in right now and all of the work that I had been doing. And so, I started with the rafts that you saw on the water, which were a lot of different things, but one of the things that they were kind of a response to a lot of very deep internal kind of intuitive anxieties around climate change. So they were nothing kind of, no type of solution. They were really just a kind of like a talisman of thinking, and of representing, and of, what does this kind of look and feel like at a certain kind of instinctual level. And so at the time when we were first working on the rafts, and I would want to talk to people about the aspect that was related to climate change thoughts, it was like it was like 2008 before the collapse, and people just really weren't interested in talking about that. And so I found that conversation really fell on a lot of deaf ears. And then in New York, when the Brooklyn Museum asked me to do a show, it was post-Sandy. So like all of a sudden New York City has had this direct experience of what it's like to be flooded and of how vulnerable we really are as a coastal community. And so it felt to me like it perhaps would be relevant to bring the rafts back just as this object to kind of to see and to feel and to think about. And then, just thinking about the environment and what else would work in there, and I ended up kind of unifying things around the symbol of a tree, because that space, I always also choose like really interesting architectural spaces that I like, and so I was responding to kind of the epicness of that space, and also just the sort of symbols of stability and kind of rootedness I think that we feel when we confront kind of trees in that way, and kind of home port. And then all of the portraits within and maybe I'll just try to go back quickly and see if I can show some images, but all of the portraits within the installation also come from these various projects that I've been working on. So there's portraits that are about the resistance of people in Brazil to the construction of a dam on the Amazon River and its tributaries that the Brazilian government is trying to push through right now without the permission of the indigenous people, or a piece that's about that's working around subjects of Braddock or of Haiti, or this one was my mother also. Both my parents passed away in the last 2 years, and that was a really big turning point with kind of looking even more deeply at this kind of trauma work and grieving and healing and all of these things. And so this piece was also kind of about the death of my mother. And so in that way that art kind of has the freedom to just link a lot of things that don't seem related and to kind of draw these sort of fantastical narratives, I was working with thinking about climate change and thinking about trauma and loss and thinking about the loss of my own mother, and then thinking about the place that we are in where we stand to lose our motherland, like our home, our, really our entire planet and the ecosystems that support us. And so just thinking, also about the connectedness between, you have people in Brazil that are fighting the kind of industrialization of their homeland, and then you have people in Braddock who this industrialization has rolled through and left them. And what is the relationship between those two groups of people? And then what is the larger relationship to us right now in the global moment that we're in, as we're kind of risking everything because of this devouring kind of capitalist process that we survive by right now? So yeah, it was about like that kind of stuff. World's shortest answer. Okay, that seems good, yeah? Anybody else? We'll close there. Oh, wait, one more.
Prosaic question, Caledonia, but how do you get this all financed, and how do you manage to make even a modest living for yourself?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So my apartment, I live in the same apartment that I've lived in for the last 12 years, and I just realized this morning, I was like, I don't even have a ladder to get to my bed. What is wrong with me? Like, I just got health insurance in the last year, so I'm like, finally the light is turning on in my head, like, oh, you should take care of yourself. You're 37 now. Like, this isn't gonna last forever that you can just take all of your money and dump it into your projects. But so far, I am very, very lucky in that I live as a studio artist. So my work actually sells for, a whole other kind of art world market, and a lot of those resources get put directly back into my projects. In addition to that, I apply for grants. I also, like I said, we have a Kickstarter that's going right now for the project in Braddock. So I'm trying to kind of diversify that, but the sort of core of so much of the funding of my work has been about that I have a market that's around the sort of portraiture, and I'm able to let that kind of fuel my projects. But like I said, because I've realized that I have then failed to actually set myself up to survive and to be able to like have a home or like things and take care of myself, I'm trying to learn to do less of that and to get the projects funded in different ways. But yeah, fundraisers and all kinds of stuff. Okay, thank you guys. You can do it too. Fundraisers, they're a pain.
Hey, I want to mention that there is, for those of you who are stepping into this, not alumni, there's public programming throughout this event this weekend, including Michael Kimmelman, the architecture critic for the New York Times, is going to be giving our closing keynote on Saturday afternoon. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Callie, so much for your energy and your talent and hard work. We are going to have a reception now in the portico rooms, which are at the end of the lobby back there. And enjoy.